My name is Jeff McAlpine. I was a 2004 Las Vegas TFA Charter Corps member, and I've been teaching and supporting Teaching in the Valley for about 14 years now. I have been an instructional coach for the past 6 years, and recently became a Ryan Fellow, so right now I'm in my Ryan Fellowship training to be a school leader. Really, my true passion in education lies with instruction and understanding teaching in classrooms. I spent the wide majority of my preps when I was in my classroom exploring in other teachers' classrooms and doing what I call participating. So I would go into a classroom, sit down as if I was a student, and participate in the lesson itself. And so it taught me a lot about instruction and what worked well, what didn't work well. I've also spent the past decade studying instructional design and methods, and we discovered this technique called 3-hire whiteboarding, which brought us really great results back when I taught at Mojave High School. And 3-hire whiteboarding is still something I'm developing. But what I found is a lot of things about instruction became very clear for me. You know, when we first start teaching, we're in that novice stage where we start to get our confidence up and go, oh, well, I have this figured out. And then we realize after a couple of years that there's a lot of details in teaching that are extremely difficult. And we verge from blaming some things on the students to now blaming our own actions as teachers, where the results we get in our classrooms are 100% our actions. And once we realize that, we know, okay, teaching is extremely difficult. And so we go through this long phase of discovery and figuring out all the ins and outs of teaching and the details of it. And when you come out on the other side, you get a simpler picture. And that's what I want to paint for you in this video series is a simple structure that you can use to think about teaching and teaching design. So really the theme of this is showing you how to plan effective lessons that will meet students' needs, but you're going to find that it's much, much more. This is not a video series on lesson planning. In fact, I'm going to start with this one, throwing some things we do in lesson planning up for debate. But I'm excited to venture down this rabbit hole with you, and hopefully some of the discoveries I've made will speak to you. And if you'd like to leave any comments or suggestions, feel free to, but let's go ahead and begin. So this is lesson 1 of a 20 video series, and this is the overview. We're going to look at something called macro design. We're going to look at this thing called a seed, and I'll give you the overview of a formula that you can see there. We're going to start to analyze that formula, and then I'm going to show you how to redesign a small part of your lesson using this formula, just for something as simple as lesson objectives. So macro design of lessons is really the big picture of the lesson, right? When you zoom way out. And usually what we do is we design in units. A unit is just simply a unit of time. And so, I have about 3 weeks, and so here's my 3 weeks worth of time, and so here's what I'm going to do. Within that unit of time, we have lessons, and so each of these squares represents a different lesson. Notice that each lesson builds on the other lesson, sort of going up towards a higher level of understanding with whatever's within that unit. And most curricula are in this format. They give you this macro view unit structure, and then they give you many lessons that build upon each other. When I was teaching science a long time ago, we didn't have a curriculum that was provided to us. So we had to design our own units, and we had to design our own lessons. And just want to show you how wonderful macro design can get. The perfectly designed school where everything ties together, where we have a math, reading, social studies, writing, science unit, and then all the others, and everything coming together in a school-wide shared content and skills that all of the lessons, all of the units share together, making this beautiful package of learning. And I've never actually seen any curriculum develop this way, where it's completely multidisciplinary, where many teachers are teaching many different subjects at the same time. But if you want to get really rich, talk to me, and maybe one day we can sell some macro design where everything is a complete package of a school. It'll probably take at least a good decade to design. Macro design is really not the focus of this video series. I found very early on that your macro design can be wonderful, but you can still not meet a lot of students' needs. And what I found was that it was micro design that mattered the most. That's the moment-to-moment interactions between students and students and students and the teacher in the classroom. And so what I'm going to do is take that lesson and break it down into a bunch of little bits and pieces and components, and I'm going to call those seeds. Before I show you what a seed is, though, I want to take a moment to talk about lesson planning. And there's a fundamental problem in the way we lesson plan. And I'm sure you felt this as well. If you ever had to design your own lessons or even look at someone else's curriculum to translate that into a lesson, traditional daily planning usually does not increase student achievement. In that, okay, so I'm going to read my macro plan, or I'm going to picture it based on a syllabus. Then I'm going to imagine the macro plan in action. I'm going to see it inside my head. And then from that point, I'm going to type what I see, translating the macro plan into my document. So I'm really just taking a macro plan and slapping it down on a piece of paper. The issue, though, is what we see inside our head. What we see in our head is usually habitual approaches to thinking. The seeds that are inside our head usually are very vague. So when you talk to someone about a lesson in a curriculum, they might use words like, oh, well, first the class is going to discuss, and then we're going to talk about, and then we're going to try, then we're going to do, and then we're going to show. And those verbs are so vague, and they don't fill in the details of those seeds, of those little micro plans, the little tiny things within the lesson, that it's really designing those that make a really powerful lesson that meets all students' needs. But what I'm going to try to outline for you is a process of taking what we see inside our head and changing it, altering it, engineering it, and actually designing our lessons so that they meet more kids' needs. Because our imagination usually gives us more of what we're used to. If we spent a decade in school sitting and listening with the raised hand, that tends to be what comes out of our head. And so the process of macro planning does nothing to meet most students' needs. It tends to just give us that traditional approach that we were used to in a classroom when we were growing up. And that brings me to what lesson planning really should be. It should be a creative process. And when we see something in our head, we manipulate it, we design it, we engineer it to alter what we see inside our head. And ultimately, we will alter the way we imagine our lessons. And so I promise you, this process is going to help you be able to do that. So that brings me to the seed formula. So we take the little tiny chunk of a lesson, and here's the formula down below, and I'm going to break each of these down and tell you what each of these parts are. So in each seed or little tiny piece of a lesson, we have what we call an element. This is the thing that we are going to think about. Okay, so right now I'm talking, and so the element is the stuff that I'm saying. You're hearing it, and well, hopefully you're thinking about it. But unfortunately with this video and any stand and deliver teaching, when the element is just sit and listen, I have no idea what you're thinking about. So an element should never be by itself. An element should always have an interaction. And that is how we're going to be thinking about it. So for example, if the element was everything I've said so far, then I could have an interaction. Okay, everyone, I want you to summarize in 2 sentences what you've learned so far. Sorry, this is not an interactive video, but you get the idea. Now I've given you an interaction. You have to think about the element and you have to interact with it in some way. So once we have an element and interaction, then we bring a tool. A tool is how we actually prove that we're thinking about it. So you were supposed to summarize what we've learned so far, and we can't prove through the camera, but I could say, all right, I want you to prove it. Do a stop and jot. So in the comment section below, type 2 sentences. Here's the 2 sentence things that you've learned so far. And that would be a tool. That way I can actually see the things that you've gotten from this. Now, to be a highly effective seed, the next thing you need is immediate feedback. And immediate feedback is how we're going to change our thinking. So you type 2 sentences down underneath that said what you've learned so far. Well, if I look at that and I think, okay, you've done a pretty good job, but I don't think you've thought enough. So I'm going to give you some feedback and say, I'd like you to extend your thinking and add 2 more sentences on. Okay, so now I've extended your thinking. Or let's say you wrote a sentence that made absolutely no sense. Then I would probably go, okay, I'd like you to revise this sentence because we did not learn this. So that's immediate feedback, right? I'm going to ask you to revise or extend your thinking. Now, that's not good enough. I have no idea if you took in my feedback, and so the revision actually has to be visible, right? We need to be able to see that someone actually revised their thinking. So that person then has to prove that the thinking has actually occurred. So overall, it's a pretty simple formula. You take something to think about, you give an interaction to think about it, a tool to prove you're thinking about it, then you get immediate feedback, and finally you revise to prove you've taken in the feedback. That's one of those seeds. And it may seem really simple, but using this seed formula, we can redesign lessons to make them extremely powerful. For those of you that were watching my whiteboard videos, this should look really familiar. Really, this is the whiteboard cycle. right? So when we use whiteboards in this fashion, we get great results. Well, now what I've done is I've zoomed even out further on that and went, well, when teaching is done in this fashion and designed in this way, you get great results, even without a whiteboard. So this formula makes a lot more sense if I show you an example. So this is just some standard traditional teaching right here. So the element is, the teacher says, okay, everyone, what is the definition of photosynthesis? So the element is the memory of that vocab term. Let's say we learned it yesterday, okay? The interaction was recall and define. That's a pretty standard thing a teacher might ask kids to do. Okay, think back to photosynthesis, recall and define photosynthesis, and then the teacher uses a tool to have someone prove they've done that. Okay, think back to photosynthesis, raise your hand please, and I'm gonna have one person tell me their definition of photosynthesis. Okay, so then the teacher calls on that person, and that person gives an answer. Photosynthesis is a dark reaction that makes sugar in the cells. Okay, well that was wrong. And so if wrong, I'm going to ask, okay, not quite. Another student, raise your hand please. And then they pick another student. And they go until that person gets it right. And then they get it right and the teacher goes, good job, way to go. And notice the revision, usually there's none on that one. You call on one student, then the next one, then the next one. You tend not to return to the students that missed it before. But this is a pretty typical design that I'm going to show you later on doesn't help your classroom whatsoever. This design actually prevents kids from learning. And that's the really interesting thing about it, is you might recognize this as a lot of what teaching is. And so now kind of going back to that idea of macro design, when a teacher looks at curriculum and they write the word discuss, what they usually mean is this process. Raise your hand and tell me, raise your hand and tell me, raise your hand and tell me. And it's actually a really flawed micro design that doesn't lead to good student achievement. So all right, so let me put this to work. Let's do some engineering. We're gonna redesign just a simple part of a lesson objective. It seems like a brainless thing. Okay, let's go over our lesson objectives now. It's written on the board, everyone, here's the lesson objective. And usually what we do is we use what I call our habitual toolboxes. And so let me show you how this tends to happen in a classroom. So the element, what we're thinking about, is the lesson objectives for the day. And it might be written up on the board. If you have a true curriculum, it'll probably be written in the lesson at the beginning. And notice the interaction, having kids think about that objective, tends not to be there. It's not stated. And so it's usually think about. Whenever you don't state something, it's very general and vague. The interaction is, well, just think about those objectives. The tool tends to be one student presents while the rest listen. In fact, I saw this the other day. Okay, I need someone to stand up and present. Go ahead and read off the objective for today. So one student stands up, everyone tracks, they look over, and then they read off the objective for the day. Or some teachers do a choral response. Okay, on the count of 3, everyone start reading here. 1, 2, 3, go. And then the whole class choral responds and reads off the objective. Now, is there any feedback? Well, you don't need any feedback, right? Because they didn't really interact with it at all. And if there's no interaction, there can't be any feedback for thinking. And if there's no feedback, well, there's no revision, right? Because you can't change your thinking if you didn't think in the first place. And so what going over the lesson objective becomes is simply this process of stand up, read it off, okay, let's move on. It's a pointless activity. Right? It doesn't really cause anyone to think about anything at all. And so literally you could probably skip it. But why don't we do that? Because someone like Marzano says you must have objectives, when really what he's saying is you must have objectives that kids know and think about. Or it says in any manual or any checklist, teacher starts by making sure students know the objective for the lesson. Well, this is not making sure students know the lesson objective. It just doesn't work. After this process, if you asked a student, what are you learning today? They probably would have no idea. Or they would have to look over on the board and read it off, which means they didn't know it anyways. And so really, what are we having them do? We're having one student practice reading something out loud, and then the rest of them will practice looking at it, and there isn't a lot of thinking involved. So that's really this process now. So this is the student experience engineering and design process. I'm going to take this one seed of a lesson, and we're going to mess with it. To mess with it, I have some toolboxes we're going to use, and I'm not going to use all of them for every redesign, but for this first one, I do want to show you all 4 redesigns. And the first one we'll look at are Teach Like a Champion tools. You're probably very familiar with Teach Like a Champion, I'm hoping. If not, well, this will teach you a little bit about it. Although I'll tell you with Teach Like a Champion, I'm going to show you how problematic some of the activities are. The next one is Cooperative Learning by Spencer Kagan. It's a beautiful toolbox, and I'll be using that one to redesign. I'm also going to be using some Whole Brain Teaching by Chris Biffle to redesign. He has some really innovative, cool things, but it's kind of out of the box. And so, and we'll see if some of you like some of the stuff I do for that redesign. I like using it, but not a lot of teachers do because it's so far outside their really habitual thinking. And then finally, I'm going to use my whiteboard toolbox that I designed in order to do some redesign as well. So our first redesign is going to be using Teach Like a Champion tools. You can see I have the old interaction up top, and let's see how we changed it. So first, the element hasn't changed, that's still the same, but the interaction has changed. Notice I'm actually stating it now. So now the interaction is a sentence stem. The objective says blank, which means during the lesson we will probably be blank. Notice for a student to interact in that way, they actually have to think about the objective, which I'll be honest, that I believe was the original intent of people saying, go over the objective. But see, those vague terms, go over means nothing, right? Really what we want students to do is to think about the objective and think about what will you probably be doing in class because of that objective. Now that we've clearly stated our interaction, we can add a tool. And because it is Teach Like a Champion, I'm going to add the tool Everybody Writes. You might be more familiar with it, called a stop and jot. But I'm going to go ahead and have students in a journal go and interact with that. Okay, everyone, you should be writing in your journal. I'll set a timer. You should be answering this in your journal. Okay, so I give students some time to do that. If I'm a great teacher, I'm probably doing some rigorous monitoring and walking around and seeing what students are doing, grading it on the spot with some checks, right, to save myself some time later on. And then I'm going to go to my immediate feedback. So now I've got what's called a show call. I'm going to find one student's writing. I'm going to put it up on the Elmo so all students can see. And then I'm going to go ahead and add my revision. Okay, everyone, add this to your list if you don't have it. So, you know, I've just taken this nice, simple objective, and I've turned it into something that is a much more rigorous process for my students. And overall, this takes just a little bit more time than what we did before, and it's a much more worthy process. Okay, so that's Teach Like a Champion. Let's go again. We're going to redesign using Spencer Kagan's Cooperative Learning, which is a beautiful toolbox. I absolutely love it. I am a huge fan of cooperative learning because of the idea of equal participation where all students have to show their thinking. Fits very well with this model. So notice the element's the same. The interaction, the objective says blank, which means during lesson we'll probably be blank. But now we're calling it a gambit. Spencer Kagan calls them spoken gambits, and this is a complete the sentence gambit. So students are going to be saying this out loud to complete the sentence. Our tool is going to be what's called a rally robin. A is going to speak first, so one student is an A, then B is going to speak second, the next student is a B. Then A is going to go, then B is going to go, then A is going to go, then B is going to go. So they're actually going to complete the sentence multiple times with each other. And that's beautiful because really the immediate feedback is built into the rally robin structure because the pairs themselves are sharing with each other and they get another chance to speak. So they're learning from their peer and then they have to revise on the spot. You know, because they're going to go again. And so the Rally Robin is so beautiful in that it gets that immediate feedback and revision built into the process. You'll notice this is not a turn and talk. And the difference between Rally Robin and turn and talk seems simple, but it's absolutely profound. In that because this is structured for equal participation, both of them are expected to get immediate feedback and both are expected to revise. And so Rally Robin is great for that. Our next redesign is Whole Brain Teaching, so get ready for some crazy, weird stuff you probably never... So I'm going to pull out of my Whole Brain Toolbox some Brainies. Brainies are simply gestures that we make while we are writing out loud is kind of what it's called. And so for a capital letter, you give a capital letter. For a comma, we go zoop. For the word and, we go and. And then at the end of a sentence, we do an end point or an end mark. Okay? And so I want my students interacting in this way. So based on the objective, zoop, today we will be blah, 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 zoop, blah, 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 zoop, and blah, blah, blah. And then they can fill in whatever three things there. Okay, and so that interaction has some Brainies built in, which just is, it's a way of getting students to write out loud and move. And that's what whole brain teaching is all about, is movement and getting to use all parts of the brain. Then I'm going to go to my tool. The main interaction tool in whole brain teaching is when the teacher claps twice and they say teach. the students clap twice and they say okay, and then they turn towards each other and they say and move together, or they take turns going back and forth saying and moving together. Notice, very similar to a rally robin. But what whole brain teaching does is it takes a rally robin and it kind of brings it up to that nth level, building in the kinesthetics. And there's a lot of different types of teach okays. Notice I have this one as a brainies teach okay. So I clap twice and say brainies, they clap twice and say okay, they turn and they write their sentence back and forth, right? A goes, then B goes, A goes, then B goes, writing their sentence out loud. Same thing as a rally robin, the feedback's built in, the revision is built in automatically on the spot. Kind of a crazy tool though, having your students move around and write, but imagine doing this over the course of a school year, how you end up having students being much better writers. And that particular type of sentence is called a triple whammy, whenever students have to list 3 things at the end of a sentence. It forces them to kind of stretch their thinking. Okay? So that's our redesign using the whole brain teaching toolbox. So we come to my last redesign toolbox, and it's the one that we designed back at Mojave through our PLC work, and that's the whiteboard toolbox. And if you want to learn more about it, feel free to look at my past videos. There's a whole series on whiteboarding. But this will be a little bit of a review for those of you that know about whiteboarding. So I've taken my interaction and I've turned it into a whiteboard starter. So based on what is said in the objective, we will probably be blank. And that's going to be a consistent thing. What are we going to be doing? And the students are going to list as many ways that they can to complete that sentence. Okay, so now that I have my element interaction, I'm going to make the tool. And in whiteboarding, it's either open or closed. So my students are going to do closed boarding. They're going to tip their boards back and try it individually on their own first. While that's happening, I'm going to do a feedback walk, which means I'm going to walk around, and this one's a positivity walk. I'm going to look for great answers, and I'm going to shout them out and celebrate those answers. And notice that's actually immediate on-the-spot feedback as well for students that are struggling. So if they don't know what to write, they hear me shout out a couple, and it helps get them started. Okay, so I also have built in a second round of feedback because that's what 3 Higher Whiteboarding is all about. We're going to do a whiteboard look. So my students are going to be asked to, you're going to add one more to your board. So let's do a whiteboard look. They hold up their boards. They look around. They look for one more to add. And they go, okay, boards down, revise your boards. And they add one more. So it fits that beautiful, perfect process. All right, so that's the intro. I kind of gave you our whole process of redesigning, looking at the formula for each seed, and then looking at how we can use different toolboxes to redesign our lessons. So for lesson 2, which is going to be coming up soon, I'm going to do a deep dive into elements themselves. And what makes a good element, what makes them tick in a classroom, and how can we take good elements from our curriculum and use them effectively. And then my next example for redesign is we're going to just go to the next part of a lesson. We're going to take a look at warm-ups and see how we can use this seed designing process in order to improve our warm-ups. All right, that's it for me. I hope you got something from this. Please feel free to leave any comments, questions. I do appreciate any feedback you have for me. Please try to make it immediate so I can revise my work on the spot. Have an excellent week at school, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.